I wanted to look at West Virginia from a philosophical perspective, and in order to do so, I wanted to seek out one of its native residents. I wasn't sure necessarily how I wanted to structure this podcast, but I thought about it, and after a while, I decided I just wanted to talk to someone about their experiences in West Virginia, their likes, their dislikes, and see what kind of insight I could gain from them. I like West Virginia a lot. I've been there quite a bit throughout my life. I've hiked there, spent time there. I'd like to live there at some point. It's a great place. And in my search to talk to someone at length about West Virginia, I was very fortunate to find a West Virginia native, Robert Dugan. Robert Dugan III offers unique insight regarding West Virginia, its history, its culture. He's a native West Virginian, a scholar, and a novelist. He wrote the book A Stranger Among Us, a novel of the West Virginia opioid crisis. And that's available on Amazon. You can find the link to that book in the description of this podcast. So we're going to dive right into it. I thank you for listening. Go buy Robert's book. And hopefully, this is part one of a continuing series on West Virginia with Mr. Dugan.
Hello.
Good afternoon, sir. How are you?
Good.
Glad we could get this set up.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, how's things been going for you? Good. Summertime, so no school after
Yeah,
a
no
crazy
school to worry
year.
about. No school to worry about right now. So,
That's good.
but a lot of anxiety surrounding
Going back.
going back and what's going to happen.
What are they doing down there? What's their procedure in your district?
Well, right now they're saying that we'll go back full time, 5 days a week. But I think that that's probably subject to change.
Yeah.
Um, they're waiting on the governor's order, and the governor seems to be waiting on county input. So it's kind of a circle at this
Yeah.
point.
Bureaucracy at its finest. You know?
Well, I think everybody's heart's in the right place.
That's good.
Uh, I don't think we have any bad actors
That's good.
that are involved in the process. So, you know, I'm willing to go and do whatever they tell me I need to go and do, but the situation changes a little bit every day.
Yeah. Did you guys have to improvise quite a bit? I know here in March or April they elected to switch exclusively to online schooling. And it was a pretty dramatic adjustment for everybody. Nobody was prepared.
Had fire alarm going
Oh,
off.
no, that's good. At least you know it works.
Yeah. There's a little baking going on out in
Oh, that's good.
the other room. So we found out that school was going to be canceled the same time as the general public did. So we didn't really have a whole bunch of lead time. So yeah, we pivoted to online almost immediately.
Had to
And
improvise.
it worked to varying degrees of success. Um, not not all good, not all bad either. Um, but it is what it is.
What are
People are
the.
trying their best, and the kids are trying their.
Oh, yeah, that's all they can do. What are the, like, socioeconomic demographics of your district? Is it pretty middle income, or is it.
No, we're looking at above average poverty level.
Gotcha.
Don't quote me on the numbers,
Sure.
but north of 60% certainly, and I would wager north of 70%
Whoa.
living below the poverty line. Um, but they're good people,
Yeah.
um, and it's a good district to work in. It's small. You get to build lots of interpersonal relationship with the kids. Um, and those kind of things. So, I stay there for that. Um, and, it's my home. So there's a special connection there, even though, I moved out last year.
No, that's awesome. The reason I ask is because I know that a lot of families don't have access to the technology that may be necessary. In some occasions, I know that the school districts here have, and I'm assuming elsewhere, have provided a lot of like Chromebooks and stuff and the means for people to do the homeschooling. But I don't know. I feel like a lot of parents, the lower the income, the more difficult it is for them to get involved, either because of work schedules or apathy or whatever, you know.
Well, my students are 11th graders.
Oh,
So,
nice.
yeah, so I can't really speak to the experience of the teachers that were doing the elementary school stuff.
Yeah.
I imagine the set of challenges that would come with that, with working with a group of kindergartners. But um, as far as my kids went, I had a couple that didn't have access to internet. The school provided devices to all the students, um, but it was still, it was a challenge for some of them to get online. It was a challenge to just get in touch with a couple of them. So yeah, it was hit and miss, and it looks like we're going to have an opportunity to try it again um, this fall. We're waiting on Jim Justice to make a decision on September the 1st. That's when he
Oh,
said
wow.
his final decision will be made
It's cutting it
about
kind of
what.
close.
Well, I think what he's trying to do is wait for the politics of things to shift a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So there's districts that went back in places like Georgia and Florida are seeing spikes in their coronavirus cases. So I think what he's trying to do is build a case for why we should be online. Um, why we should be online in the fall for people who don't necessarily think that we should.
Well, that's good that he's kind of advocating for that.
He's been great. He's really done a good job of handling it in a heavily Republican political atmosphere that can be difficult to do. But I think it speaks to something that is maybe misunderstood about West Virginia as a political entity. Is that they have a tendency toward voting Republican, but not necessarily favoring Republican political agendas on the national stage. Um, so, it's, we have a Democratic senator and a Republican senator, and, Republicans that we send to the House of Representatives. And then we have uh, Jim Justice he was elected as a Democrat and then switched his party. Um, so politically speaking, West Virginia is really interesting
Yeah.
once you get into the politics of it.
I think a lot of that is the communal sentiment of we don't really need nothing from nobody, you know? They're their own autonomous entity in a way.
Well, I think I've read a lot of different books on the region, and there's a popular idea that's been floated that the reason West Virginia um, kind of behaves so differently when it comes to, well, in Appalachia as a whole, behaves so differently when it comes to national politics is um, remnants of a kind of like isolated Scots Irish culture
Yeah.
that hasn't really had to deal with a lot of forceful outside influences. So, West Virginians, they, speaking generally, um, they tend to be independent. They tend to be suspicious of outsiders, but also there's a predominance of a kind of like live and let live attitude. Um, so my community in general is really welcoming of uh, differences. So race difference, sexual orientation difference, those things don't seem to bother people or get the kind of attention on a local political level that they do on the national level. It's just like your right to swing your fist stops at my face. You leave me alone, I'll leave you alone, and everybody's happy. Um, so I think in general, domestic politics, West Virginians tend to be pretty liberal in most instances. Um, so the I don't know what foothold Republicanism has um, in the area. I think for sure, most West Virginians would self-identify as Republican, um, but I don't know that that comes through necessarily in the things that they believe on an interpersonal level in their communities.
I mean, without getting too political, the definitions of the two party systems are almost so explicit now with the intention of bifurcating everyone. You know what I mean? It's like if you are liberal, this is how you are. You believe this and this is how it is, and if you're Republican, it's this way. And people are so separated along those lines. They just kind of pick one to gravitate towards more than the others. And I think rural communities in general are much more, or seem to be, from my experience, more affiliated with conservative politics and things of that nature. I mean, that's just how it is in Ohio. The three areas that vote Democrat are Cleveland, Columbus, and Cincinnati. Beyond that, everywhere else that's an agricultural community is Republican. People just they don't really get into it too much, and they just try to pick which side is somewhat reflective of their value system, I guess. But it makes
Well,
sense that West Virginians, being predominantly rural in a way, would tend to lean towards the right a little bit.
well, I think that you hit on a valid point there because I think the parties right now are so far apart as to almost not be useful for most people. That there's not enough compromise between the two so that they're useful as a political demarcation. Um, West Virginia's unique position, though, I think is rooted in organized labor in the area. So, one of the things that is unique about West Virginia is that it has a rich history of being kind of the origin site for um, labor movements in the United States. You see this originally with things like the coal strikes, because the practices at coal mines in the early 20th century were just horrendous. The company owns your home; they pay you in company script. Um, More recently, uh, West Virginia struck out with the teacher strikes and led to teacher strikes in places like Arizona and Chicago. Um, so, as far as Republicans are the politics of big business, I think a lot of West Virginians find find that part problematic. There's, in my community where I grew up, there's a sand mine, and strike happened. I want to say it was in the 70s or the 80s, but it went on for years. Um, and so when teachers went on strike, um, there was still kind of the memory of um, people having to grow gardens to feed themselves because dad was on strike from the sand mine trying to get a fair wage and better benefits. And so even people who weren't necessarily sympathetic to the reasons that we were striking um, refused to cross the strike lines. Um, you know, People just don't cross picket lines in West Virginia. Um, a lot of the time, um, and I think the suspicion of outsiders has its roots in that too, because when the strikes were happening in the coal mines and things like the Battle of Blair Mountain and those other huge labor movements, um, coal mine companies busting migrant workers from out of state. And a lot of those coal mines were held by outside state interests. Um, so West Virginians, they want to keep as much of our politics and arguments in house as possible, um, which which leads to, especially in the school system, a certain amount of innovation. West Virginia is a great place to be a teacher. Apart from the political issues and the low pay comparative to the states that are around it. Um, there are a lot of really hard fought rights that teachers have in West Virginia that they don't have elsewhere. So,
Which part of the state did you say you're near Morgantown?
Morgan County,
Morgan
so
County, that's right.
in the eastern panhandle, nestled
Okay.
between Virginia and Maryland.
Okay, nice.
Yeah.
I got you.
So,
Okay. Yeah, there's a certain community orientated sentiment that seems to be shared by a lot of people that live there, at least from my perspective, in the sense that everybody seeks to take care of each other. And I'm not sure if that's smaller, or I mean, if it's because West Virginia's, there's a lot of communities that are smaller and spread throughout the state. There's larger urban communities, but it's like people
um,
are kind of tucked away.
I think that's one of the things that's most special about the state as a whole is well, and I can only speak to my experience in my community. You go to places like Morgantown or Huntington or Charleston, and
How many
things are.
people live in your community?
There are a couple of thousand families.
Wow.
The school systems, the school that I teach at's got about 650 kids.
Okay.
Um, which for a high school, for an entire county, um, is relatively small. Um, and I think I think that the idea of middle America, um, that most of us have in our minds, that classic, white picket fence and kids playing outside and those kind of things. And kind of like the neighborhood children being a sort of community property that everybody looks after. That was very much my experience growing up. So, summertime, I left out the front door after breakfast and didn't come home until dark. Just wandered around the neighborhood or went to the municipal pool that's there in the center of town or spent time in the park. Um, and nobody ever wondered if I was safe, or, going to come home at the end of the day. So, I think that was one of the things that I think is special about the community that I grew up in. Now, I haven't been a kid for a long time, so I don't know if that's still the case, but you can drive through town and see young people out walking or spending time in the park, going here or there. There are still opportunities for kids to have the kind of like unsupervised fun that that you see popularized in films like The Goonies and things like that. it's still possible.
It's uncommon today. That's what's interesting to me about that kind of social environment for children is that what was commonplace 50, 60 years ago is almost unheard of now, especially in larger communities. But it still occurs where you live. You know what I mean? Like there's still that opportunity for kind of a community shared vigilance of members of the community just kind of watching out for the children and everything like that.
Oh yeah, I mean, if I got in trouble as a kid, my mom knew it before I got home, in an age before smartphones.
Yeah,
Right. So, all of the neighbors had her phone number and they were all looking and keeping
right.
an eye on us. We got into our share of trouble, but, you know, nobody got hurt. So, not for lack of trying, certainly.
Mm-hmm.
But
No, it's interesting. And how long have you been teaching at your current position? You said 11th grade, and you teach
uh,
English, right?
th- this will be this will be my fifth year in the district.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you're an
So,
English teacher? You
yes.
do
Yeah.
American or British English? That's how they divide
American
it up here.
American Lit. So
Nice.
11th grade is
Emerson,
American.
Thoreau,
Yep.
Hawthorne.
So in general, I start with The Crucible by Arthur Miller.
Okay.
That's one of our cornerstone texts.
Nice.
And it's very useful. It's illustrative of kind of like this potentiality that people seem to have for um, seizing upon some perceived threat, whether or not that threat is valid, and then kind of finding it everywhere. So if all you have is a hammer, then every problem looks like a nail, kind of thing. So I ask the kids to kind of think about what the modern equivalent of witchcraft is. So what's the thing that we're trying to hunt and suss out, and is it a legitimate threat? So over the years, that's changed. Um, Most recently, one of the more popular answers that I get is illegal immigration. Um, the kids talk about that. And then, prior to that, it was terrorism, um, things like baggage claim at baggage checks at the airport and stuff like that. They drew comparisons there. And then we move on to Steinbeck and Of Mice and Men, and do some Thoreau, a little bit with Hawthorne, and it's my favorite kind of subsection of literature to play around in as an idea.
Yeah.
So
That's awesome. Yeah, I was always really fascinated with, I'd say, American romanticism in a way. Emerson and Thoreau were two of my go tos. That's what I remember from my American literature courses. And I've
I think
read Walden about like 4 or 5 times. It's a heavy text, and there's something that can be taken out of it every time.
I don't think people realize just how much of American identity is tied up in the American Renaissance
Yeah.
with Emerson and Thoreau. The idea of frugality, self-reliance, um, venturing into the wilderness. We're lucky in West Virginia to have as much wilderness as we have. Um, those were some of my favorite things to do as a kid. Was summertime, raspberries come on, and you go pick a couple of gallons, and mom makes a cobbler or a pie. You know, Late spring, or yeah, so around May when the morels come out, you go trudge around in the woods trying to hunt mushrooms, and um, that outdoor identity and being in touch with um, the fluctuations and variations and signs and signals that nature presents is a real part of the kind of like identity of West Virginia. Things like, certain kinds of birds will make certain kinds of noises when deer are around. Those kind of like little things that you just learn um, from old people, being a kid in that area, and spending as much time as you do outside, I think is a lost and kind of dying skill set that's still alive and very much well in West Virginia.
There's still a sense of connection to the wilderness, to the environment, to nature, because it's a lot more accessible in a way. I feel like we've really deviated over time away from our connection that we have with nature, more or less. Like I've always enjoyed reading. Well, that's why I asked about Thoreau, is because it seems as if you could create an analogy between his text and the West Virginian environment in a way. There's a lot of elements to his writing that are reflected in the state. I'm sure you could say that about a lot of things, but it seems applicable. But people have become somewhat disconnected in a way from their environment. And the reason I like West Virginia so much is because there's a lot of accessibility there with respect to the natural environment. I mean, it's very, very much a wilderness. It's awesome. I mean, I think I
Well,
expressed I want to move there at some point, and it's because there's nowhere else really around here, in my opinion, that's such a vast uh, wilderness in a way. You know what I mean? That Appalachian region, and that's where it all starts.
and that that's built on a couple of things. So I agree with the point about Thoreau. Thoreau considered nature to be kind of like a grounding mechanism for human beings. If something is off in your life, then Thoreau believed that you could go to the woods and figure out what it was. And um, you know, the ideas of civil disobedience and self-reliance and a synergistic relationship with nature are all present in those writings of the transcendentalists, and it's part of the West Virginia identity. Um, Now, the thing that has changed, I think, is that, well, of course, there's more people. So the number of, 500-acre lots that people are holding um, has shifted and grown a lot smaller. And in West Virginia, at least in my community, it was not trespassing was not really much of a thing that people worried about. So if I needed to cut through your yard to go somewhere, that
No big deal.
that wasn't a thing. People wouldn't come out of their house
Shoot
and
you.
and shoot you and try. I mean, well, some people would.
Yeah,
It depends
you always got those
depends
types.
on you got the people around the neighborhood are the one who are going to be angry about it and who
Yeah, you
aren't.
know which yard to go through, which one not, which one to avoid.
Yeah, but I mean, I spent an awful lot of time hiking on other people's property and never had any difficulty with, and to make a broad sweeping generalization, I had far fewer difficulties and run-ins with people who had been in the state a long time and were native. Anytime I ever got screamed at by anybody for being in their yard, they had generally moved in from some kind of urban area, um,
Interesting.
Baltimore or Washington or one of the neighboring, mid-sized cities. Um, you know, and I think that comes back to there's a whole set of social rules and norms around outdoor spaces um, that you get um, taught in West Virginia as a young age. So my dad was a hunter, so he was really big on rules like leave no trace. Um, so when you're out, it's the idea that when you're outside, you shouldn't alter the environment in any way. and nobody should know that you've been there. Um, so things that people do, like kids do, they hang on a branch or break the branch off, or um, you know places where I've been kayaking or river floating, and people have left trash behind. You know, you clean it up. You just clean up after them. Even things like if you are hunting and you shoot a deer, then you're expected to use as much of that animal as you can, um, because you've pulled it off the land. So all of those things are part of the culture. And I think that it's kind of helped preserve West Virginia as a place for people who enjoy the outdoors.
I agree. I mean, I feel like people have lost. Our society has created a means through which it's a lot easier to feel disconnected from the environment. The environment is some kind of external thing, especially nature, wilderness, outdoor space. It's an external thing that you go and you access on the weekends for some recreation, and you went to the park and walked your dog, and then you came home and watched Netflix for 6 hours, you know. But people, like you had talked about with Thoreau, people can find some sense of salvation or inner peace by exploring nature, because it's as if they're returning back to something very ancient within themselves, something primordial in a way. And my background is in biology, and I understand that ecological processes are interconnected and interdependent. So, environment isn't just something that you go experience and then walk away from, but it's something that's a part of you and that you should feel intimately connected to in a way. But I feel as if it's difficult to achieve that level of connection with so many modern conveniences. And perhaps that's one of the reasons I'm so intrigued by West Virginia and wish to ultimately spend more time there, is because there's so much accessibility with regard to outdoor recreation, and you feel a sense of completion within yourself. I don't know if you want to refer to it as spiritualism or not, but it is kind of like a intimate connection. And getting back to like the leave no trace, I feel as if a lot of people have no qualms about going somewhere and leaving a bunch of garbage or messing stuff up because they feel disconnected, you know? It's easier to leave no trace if you view the environment that you're in, if only temporarily, as a part of yourself. You're not going to trash out your house. You're not going to trash out your body. This is where this is part of you. So,
Well, the care for the land, I mean, I'll say this. When I was a kid, um, you know, we didn't have a whole lot of money. And so when hunting season came, that was where we got our meat for most of the rest of the year. Um, so to trash the place that you depend on for part of your food supply, the berries in the summer, the morels in the late spring, the float trips on the river, the deer hunting in the fall, squirrel hunting was a big thing when I was growing up too. We If we could find it, we'd eat it.
sure.
Squirrels, snapping turtles. Well, just one time for the snapping turtle, but I mean, I've had snake. You know, just the idea that you would shit where you eat is is so
Yeah.
terribly offensive to me. But it's like you said, it's a different type of relationship. If I venture out into the woods to feed my family, then you gain a respect and a perspective for that ground. And I think that's, maybe to bring it back to politics for a minute, I think that's one of the reasons that you see West Virginians, doing the best they can to protect the environment from the outside interests. We're known for mountaintop removal and those kind of things, but I'll tell you, the I've seen some pretty big fights over things like pipelines, um, breaking up family farms, and factories coming in that are going to spew, toxic chemicals
Yeah.
out into the air. And I don't. It just is another part of the complexity of the West Virginia identity. Because you would think that a group that votes Republican as much as West Virginians do would be ecstatic about a new factory or a new pipeline moving into the area. And there's a certain percentage of the people that are, but um, the the connection to the land, I think, West Virginians are always kind of at odds with themselves, right? It's like we want to vote Republican, but we're also pro labor. Um, we want jobs, but we also want to protect the environment. It's it's such a beautifully oppositional place, and it's just why I'm kind of such a big fan of it.
Well, it's
It's just
unfortunate that
always.
that's frowned upon in a way. People are led to believe that you shouldn't uphold contradictory views politically. That you need to conform to all of the views that are valued by either the left or the right. There's a diminishing political independence in a way, like true people that vote independent, you know, and people within your state seem to be able to recognize what's within their best interests, and they're also weary of outsiders, as you said. They're skeptical, you know. They know
I'm
that.
gonna I'm gonna drop my video off here. Having some connection issues, and
No,
I
that's
think I
fine.
want to free up a little bandwidth. So
Yeah, that's cool.
see if that helps.
But what was I saying?
You still there?
Yeah, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry for the connection
No
issues.
problem. This is actually the smoothest call I've had so far. I'm getting new to all this. I'm kind of new to all this, and I'm just kind of developing my methodology, as it were. I was watching one video that you had on your website where you did some reading from your book,
Yeah,
I believe. So,
yeah. That was we put that out um, during the early days of the coronavirus when still there was a time when COVID first started where you wanted to still be productive. You hadn't quite given in to um, the, the idea that you're just going to sit around and watch TV and eat cookies all day. Um, I had the rough draft of that novel, and we polished it up and uh, managed to get it sent out on Amazon and had it sold. Um, it was an exciting time. It was also a intimidating time. You send something out into the world to be judged. So that's why I commend you for trying to start a podcast, because it's difficult, man. It's difficult to send something out there and have people uh, look at it and comment on it in the internet vacuum where negative opinions seem to get more traction.
I love it. I love the negative opinions. I thrive on those as an artist, as opposed to if I write something, piece of poetry, for instance. I used to write a lot of poetry back in the day. I read it. Oh, that's great. I like it a lot. I'd much rather somebody tell me why it sucks and how I could do better in their opinion, even if I disagree with them, just because I value the criticism and it drives my desire to want to improve myself. You know what I mean? But it is challenging to put it out there. But it's funny you say that because that's one of the reasons I'm doing this. I'm hoping people will like access it and say, "Oh, this sucks because of this. You could have done this better." Blah blah blah. A lot of it is just, you know, nonsense. People just want to troll, you know. But every once in a while, you will get some real constructive criticism that will benefit you, and it's weird to put yourself in that situation to open yourself up to that. And I can imagine that's how it was putting that book out there for you. But it seems like you got a pretty positive response, you know.
Well, it was definitely a novel of place. So, it was a thing that I wanted to write to capture something that was unable to be captured in another way. So what I felt was that you know there were experiences that I could draw inspiration from, and then capture that and distill it into you know kind of a piece about a reflection on a place and time, right? So the early days of the opioid epidemic as it reached West Virginia, it was kind of like what I wanted to focus on. Drugs don't feature very prominently in the book, and it's only the last couple of chapters where the actual opioids happen. But what I was trying to do was illustrate how um, the things that we talked about in terms of um, West Virginia, the kind of like the community property, the allowing the kids to go out and experience life in a way that's kind of unsupervised, and um, those kind of things ultimately made West Virginia ripe for that kind of exploitation. And the opioid crisis is the just the latest in a long history for the state of corporate exploitation. Before that, there were other industries that were looking to withdraw money um, from the state through these predatory practices, and opioids did the exact same thing. There was there the thing that I remember in retrospect being the most startling about the opioid epidemic was that the pills were billed as safe and non-addictive. So,
Gotta love it.
well, the sales material for those things, I mean, you can find these online, and I looked at a bunch of them in research for the book, but um, the the handbooks that the doctors were receiving for the prescription of these drugs, they billed them as some kind of like miracle, consequence-free cure-all for pain.
I remember them talking about that in the one documentary I watched. I think it was The Pharmacist on Netflix. Did you see that one?
I did not.
It's interesting. It talks about an individual who was a pharmacist in the Midwest, and he lost, I believe, his son to an overdose, and he just went out there and raised hell against, bringing against the pill mills more or less that had been set up. And the other one I watched was called Oxyana. Have you seen that one?
I have not seen that one either.
That one's about West Virginia, and it's a 2013 documentary that talks about southern West Virginia, the town down there called Oceana in Wyoming County. and they talk extensively about kind of what you're referring to now.
Well, I mean, you had millions of pills being prescribed
Yeah.
for communities that are, you know, that don't even have 100,000 people.
Yeah. Well, hold on real quick. What was the one? It was. I remember hearing about this. Yeah, Kermit, West Virginia.
There's like 30 people that
Millions.
live down there.
Yeah. And they just had millions and millions of pills. Like it was just crazy. These pill mills.
Well, it was a big industry.
Yeah.
You
It's
know,
illegal drug dealing.
I had, um, I mean, I saw people selling pills, um, in schools. When
Oh,
I was
really?
when I was a student, I saw, or I mean, rather, I heard about parents even giving their children pills to sell. you know, so it was a huge just toll on the communities as a whole, and it rocked them to the foundation in ways that we are just only now coming to terms with being able to understand. And then once the real mess of it was once the powers that be kind of realized that something was off with the pill mills, they cracked down and then provided no other social services. So now your supply this drug
Highly addictive drug.
of this highly addictive drug is
It's
just
cut off.
dried up. And the withdrawal, I mean, have you ever seen somebody go through an opiate withdrawal?
No. But
it's it's
I've heard it's
horrifying.
terrible, you know?
It's horrifying. It's not
You,
like
it'll
it,
really
it
mess you up.
well, it's something that should be monitored by a health professional.
Yeah.
Um, and so the pill mills dried up, and then what you ended up having step into the vacuum was heroin
Yep.
from places like Baltimore. um, there was a convoy of people driving from the Eastern Panhandle to Baltimore and back again to provide these people who were addicted to opioids with heroin, because pills were no longer available. And then, at least with the pills, you had some semblance of quality
Dose
control.
and
You had
quality control.
you had dose, you had quality control. Um, you had those things being manufactured in lab safe conditions, and then you switch that to heroin that's being cut up with coffee creamer and God
Who
knows what else.
knows? Yeah.
And so it just traded one for the other without providing people with any um, without any coping mechanisms. Or I mean, the Suboxone clinics and the methadone clinics didn't pop up until years later.
That's an interesting period of time, I bet. From the moment the pills get cut off and the heroin starts pumping in to when people can finally start getting relief. You know what I mean?
Well, I mean,
That's crazy. I
it,
didn't realize
it,
there was such a long period of time. Like there was such a pronounced gap, more or less.
well, there was a huge gap between when the pills were cut off and when the clinics were set up. And in a lot of the cases, the clinics weren't set up as quickly in West Virginia as they were set up in neighboring states. So, for example, where I'm from, what happened was a lot of people had to drive into Maryland to go to their pain management clinics, and this is still the case.
How far is that?
So if you could imagine, you're addicted to pills, and that addiction causes you to perform poorly at your job, and then at some point I mean, you're facing economic hardship anyway, because in those days, pills were running, 8 to 15 to even higher numbers for a dose, depending on which variety you were getting. Um, so you're already facing an economic hardship, because now your work life is unreliable. And then you have to somehow secure transportation and an appointment. You have to navigate all that bureaucracy to go to a pain management clinic, and then you have to drive there, 35, 45, 50 minutes one way to get your dose for the day, and then drive back to go to work.
That's a lot of work.
Yeah, I mean, you're making a round trip commute before you even get to your job. And you know the people who managed to do that and get themselves clean, I mean, it was just a Herculean undertaking. And a lot of people just say, well, what the hell am I doing this for when I can get heroin a
Yeah.
lot cheaper?
Why spend all this time?
Yeah, why spend all of this time and effort and money when I can just do heroin?
Exactly.
And and it's still not there. um, the kind of services and things that people need, are still not widely available in every community where they're needed. um, and it seems like what has put a major dent in it is just information and education, um, because now people are aware of the risks. Like I said before, there was no awareness, there was no education, um, concerning these pills when they first started to become ubiquitous in the population. So everybody thought, oh, we can just take these and it'll
It's a
be a good
miracle
time.
pill.
Yeah, we can take these and it'll be a good time, no harm, no foul. And you know, the progression, for some reason, there were a lot of value judgments around the difference between doing pills and then snorting heroin. So like doing pills was not as bad as snorting heroin.
Yeah. That's
Snorting
the high flouting stuff, like it's fancier, much fancier to do the pills than it is to snort the heroin. And
and then injecting heroin was
it's
considered
Nevada.
like worse yet. So
Yeah.
it's like, man, you're really a drug addict now if you're injecting heroin.
Yes. How about
Uh,
this? Like, I gotta ask you real quick.
sure.
Uh, do you feel as if the presence of the pills and subsequently heroin created somewhat of an economic opportunity in the region for a lot of individuals? Because it seems like the common portrayal is that there's limited economic opportunities. You go to a coal mine, you go to Dollar General. There's not much. I'm sure that's a misconception to an extent. But from an economic perspective, do you feel as if this kind of provided individuals with some kind of financial liquidity that was previously inaccessible? It's hard to say. I know speculation, but
So from my perspective, and again, this is just my perspective, I think that the root of the pill epidemic was the lack of economic opportunity. Right. So there's a famous experiment, and I mean, God, thing about doing podcasts is you don't have access to all of the things that you think you read and the things that you think you know, and
we
then
can look it up. I don't
yeah.
care.
So if you would for me,
Yeah.
the experiment was, they basically, what they did was they put rats in cages. In one of the cages, there were no toys or other rats or anything like that. So lone rat in a cage with water, and then water laced with cocaine. And then in the second cage, you had another rat with Maybe there was a female rat in there, maybe there were a bunch of toys and things for the rat to do, right? So the rat that was in the but that rat, the second rat who was in the fun cage, also had access to cocaine. So the rat that was by itself with nothing to do but do cocaine, big shocker, did cocaine
Right.
and did it to its detriment. And then the rat that otherwise had things to do, it would try the cocaine a little bit, but then once it realized that there was a negative effect, it wouldn't continue to do it, wouldn't touch it. So I think, for West Virginia, the lack of economic opportunity is what caused um, what gave the opioid epidemic an even greater foothold. On top of that, too, the type of jobs that are available to most West Virginians involve some kind of labor. So, I mean, you're trading the soundness of your body for a living. Um, and then if you look at the disability numbers for West Virginia, they're a lot higher. So you had these
Sure. It's
people,
risky stuff.
well, so you had these people who were breaking their bodies down for a living,
Yeah.
people on disability. Their doctor prescribes them opioids.
Yep.
So now they're getting a check from the government. They don't have a whole lot to do, and they have these pills that are being thrown at them. So you know you put all of that together, and it just makes an opportunity for something like the opioid epidemic to take hold.
It's a lethal combination. I found this one study. It's called Rat Park. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah,
Canadian psychologist Bruce K. Alexander.
I think that's the one.
And it said that the conclusion was that drug addiction is at least as much about social and environmental factors as the drug itself, and is
Yeah,
supported anecdotally by recovered addicts, many of whom insist that addiction is not about any particular drug, but is a state of being that requires a change to a healthy environment and social circle for full recovery. It's interesting. It says it was initially rejected by peer reviewed scientific journals, but was later published in pharmacology, biochemistry, and behavior. So that's pretty interesting because coming from a scientific background, I know that social psychology and stuff is often frowned upon uh, in a way. But that's pretty neat that it ended up being published in a respectable scientific journal. But yeah, no, I agree with that. That there's a lot of elements sociologically that impact those decisions. Part of that, and what I've heard talked about quite a bit with respect to West Virginia, is that there's a sense of fatalism in the state. That like people feel as if their options are exceedingly limited, and the options that they do have, like you just said, are often hazardous and debilitating and physically and psychologically uh, dangerous.
yeah.
Which can
So
kind of lead to addiction in a way, an influential factor.
so back to your original question about whether or not um,
Economic circumstances.
the opioid epidemic improved economic circumstances um, for some people. So, in my experience, I think the answer to that question is no. And I'll tell you why. Because I think most of the people who were doing pills were also selling pills and vice versa.
Just to
So,
maintain their addiction.
yeah, so I think if you look at the amount of overlap between people who were dealing those drugs and people who were doing their own product, I think you'd find that it was almost 100%. So
That's the
any
golden rule, man. You're not supposed to get high on your own supply. You know.
yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, if you set out to intentionally go into business as a drug dealer, then then maybe you can play by the rules. But
If you're just trying to fuel your addiction by selling some pills, you're already
yeah,
trapped.
you start doing pills, and then you find yourself in a group full of people that are also doing pills, and so you sell some to your friend, and then you sell some to your buddy's friend, and it just kind of, and then next thing you know, you're dealing pills, you know, and I don't know anybody who I saw, like that was involved in that community, at least that I observed, who ended up with, a nicer car or
They benefited from it ultimately,
yeah, no, the long they might have benefited some in the short,
initially.
but
My
it
thought
didn't.
process was like, there's not many options. I don't think that's a misconception. You've kind of alluded to that as well. There's not a lot of choices when it comes to places to work as compared to larger cities and stuff. That's just how it is in rural communities in general. Like there's manufacturing, there's coal mines, there's retail stores, consumer places, restaurants, sometimes gas stations. There's not a lot. What I'm thinking is that when faced with such limited opportunities, people saw the opportunity to, hey, I can sell some drugs and as an alternative under the radar, make some money. But it would make sense that people didn't really go into it for that purpose, in as much as they went into it to kind of prop themselves up in the throes of addiction. They're already they can't they can't necessarily fund their addiction independently. They don't just have money to throw at it. So what do?
Well,
You sell the
and
drugs.
the jobs that are available, um, are uniquely suited to to manufacturing misery. So yeah, I mean, working at the dollar store is fine for a short to midterm solution, for some people, but the type of I think the mass of people who would work that kind of job wouldn't identify with it, and so and it's a problem across our culture, right?
Sure.
The idea that people sitting in uh, cubicles. There's famous movies like Office Space that talk about the rise of corporate culture and corporate misery.
Right.
Um, you know, Appalachia was not um, immune to that kind of disenchanting with the American dream that started around industrialization and then was exacerbated by the shift to kind of a corporatocracy.
Yeah, I mean, and I think outside interests, which undoubtedly have exploited West Virginia in a lot of ways, have kind of recognized a void that could be filled there. You know, it just seems strange to me that there has to be some analysis that's performed by people that pick where to put a Dollar General franchise. That's just the big thing for me. Is if Dollar General's everywhere. I saw a meme not too long ago where there's a dude down in a coal mine. He's like, "Well, it was bound to happen eventually," and he's looking across the coal mine. And it's just like a Dollar General in the actual coal shaft. Yeah, and I'm like, they're everywhere. It's crazy. It's interesting to me to think about the kind of implications that has because Dollar General just you can't go there and get healthy food, like it's just the basic necessities, survival stuff.
Well, I
I
mean,
don't know, it's just something I associate with rural communities.
it's even more insidious than that, right? So Dollar General, they do their market research and they find out the things that most people are buying. So they come in, they offer items below the cost of
Mom and pop
the
shops.
local mom and pop shops.
Yeah.
They close the mom and pop shops up, and then there's no place to buy lettuce.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
so you end up in a place where the best thing you can get at the freshest thing you can get at the grocery store is, a box of tasty cakes and a tombstone pizza.
Yeah.
And then it just all feeds into the cyclical nature of that
Negative
kind.
feedback loop.
Appalachian hopelessness that people feel. It's like you're what ends up happening is you don't even have the opportunity to better yourself, right? So like if I say, "Oh, I want to lose weight," well, if the only food store that I have access to is the Dollar General at the bottom of the hill from my apartment complex, it's going to be really hard for me to do. Um, and so all these problems, they just compound one another, and they should never have been allowed to happen in the first place. The idea that people have no options for, they couldn't even buy healthy food if they wanted to, um, is just abhorrent. And then to further the idea, that then these same people, are told, oh well, you could choose to live a different life if you want to. Well, if I gotta drive to a Suboxone clinic 45 minutes one way and then drive back to work my job at the water plant for $11 an hour, and then I can't go to a grocery store to prepare a healthy meal for me or my family. It's like, what in the hell are you supposed to do?
You're trapped.
Yeah. And you can't even save enough money to get out of it if you wanted to. And that's not even getting into things like consumer debt culture that's prevalent in the area. Um, Other predatory practices like pawn shops and payday loan vendors
Yes.
and car title loans. Those type of things that.
Isn't there gambling down there too? I remember seeing these little shacks where you could like, it's just some small like 5 by 10 building. They got like slot machine in there or
Well,
something.
so they let so you can play poker slots in most bars,
Okay.
believe it or not. So, you open up a little bar and, you might sell a couple of beers across the counter, but you're making most of your money on the poker slots. And those places depend on that revenue, but, it there's a lot of business around that does not promote well-being.
Sure. Because
So,
people that are making money don't really give a shit. The shareholders at Dollar General could give a fuck less if Joe Schmo down there in the Wolf is out of shape because he doesn't have access to nutritional food. They don't. I mean, and that's the whole thing. Is like things have ballooned to such a disproportional extent economically
well,
that
and
it's easier to be apathetic towards the consumer base. Like mom and pop shops. You know the owners. You know what they have there. They know what to get. There's a community oriented connection that occurs. But you throw in the Dollar General, it's like they don't give a shit.
well, and more so than that, the mom and pop money stays in the community. There's
Yeah,
no,
that too.
there's no, the purpose of a lot of those stores is to withdraw as much profit from wherever they are as
It's
possible.
like mining.
Yeah. So they're pulling that money out of the community, and then they have a lot of them have, not all of them, but a lot of them have explicit policies against doing things like donating to little league teams, or you know school teacher comes in and asks for $25 for a community function or
Hell
something
no.
like that.
Really?
They written policies against providing those funds.
That's pretty nefarious. I did not know that. That's interesting.
Go to a dollar store and ask them if you can have $25 for little.
They'll tell you to get the fuck out of here. That's
They'll-
hilarious.
Yeah. So
Wow,
it's
that's crazy.
it's such, the stranglehold is so tight and getting
Sure.
tighter all the time.
What
Um,
what can we do, or what steps do you take? I'm not looking for an all-encompassing solution, of course, but I mean, what have you found to be beneficial in the long run, especially when working to influence younger generations. You're with kids right at that age where they're just about to head out into the world. It's like, do you have any ideals particularly that you try to communicate to them?
Well, for me, what I try to communicate to my students is that education is the way out, right? So, and one of the best things about West Virginia is that, you know, publicly, um, education, especially post-secondary education, you can get an associate's degree in West Virginia for free
Really?
at any, yeah. So there's something called the I think it's the West Virginia Invests grant. So they'll pay for your first 2 years of school.
That's awesome.
I got my undergraduate degree for free because of something called the Promise Scholarship that was state funded. Um, and without that money, I would not be a school teacher.
That
Um,
was the ticket for you in a lot of
so
ways.
so education is key. Um, and I I don't think it'll work for every kid, you know, um, because some are they're just fighting such huge battles at home and in their close knit circle that's around them. That I mean, there's also kind of a on the darker side, there's a little bit of an anti-intellectual bent um,
They don't
to
want
this
you to
thing.
be a nerd.
Well,
You can be too smart. You
it's
know,
it's more than that. It's this idea that if I go away and learn,
I won't be welcome here.
I won't. When I come back, there's going to be people are going to feel inferior. You know,
Oh,
it's the idea like, oh, you went away, you think you're too good for us, that kind
yeah.
of thing. Um, and it's unfounded, but it's very real. And so it's not always also like a lot of people operate under the assumption that if a young person wants to go out and get an education, everybody's going to be happy and supportive, and that's not always the case.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people say, uh, well, let me put it this way. One of my favorite books was October Sky and the movie.
Homer Hickam, yeah,
Yeah, Homer Hickam, and that was one of the primary motifs within that narrative of his is that if you want to get the hell out of here, go to school. His teacher, I think it was his English teacher, right, was like, you need to, pursue this science fair, and that's your ticket out. But there was a lot of his father was like, "What? You're too good to work in the coal mine? Like what's wrong with that? We've done this for years, for generations. Like." And that's kind of that anti-intellectualism that you're maybe referring to, as it's
yeah,
like, what's wrong with how we live here and the way things are, you know.
and that still exists, um,
I can see it.
and it's problematic, for sure, for young people who are kind of looking for. I don't like to say a way out because that kind of denotes that West Virginia is something in need of escaping.
Yeah, and that you shouldn't go back. You should be
And
kind of ashamed of being from there in a way.
well, and the identity of that place is so much, it's so much stronger for the people that live there than just being their home. And I think it gets back to that connection to nature, is like you're tied to that physical place, and you're tied to that community of people who helped raise you, through, I mean, things like church, or even something as simple as walking into a business and knowing the lady behind the counter. So you get tied to that place. It's not easy to leave, um, and it's also not easy to come back. But it's super worthwhile, to do both of those things, um, because that's how these communities grow and get better. One of the reasons that West Virginia can't attract the type of businesses that provide people with a living is because there's not enough education in the workforce. You know, if I want to open, you know, if I want to open a factory in West Virginia, well, then I need to be able to hire an engineer, and I need a crane operator, and like, you need all of these things, and there's just not enough skill in the workforce to be able to promote a lot of those type of businesses in the rural communities. So I really think education is the secret to to accomplishing a lot of the things that West Virginians say they want to accomplish for their communities. You know, I have students who, or former students who, want to set out and better themselves. Um, but, they turn 18 and they get a car payment, credit card debt, and the next thing they know, they're too strapped down to make those kind of moves. Um, because of those type of predatory business practices that we were talking about earlier. So it's a closed system, that a feature of it is to perpetuate itself. Um, and the secret to escaping it is knowing better before you make those kind of irrevocable mistakes. Um, and the opportunity is there for the people that want to come out and get it. The state's done really well with making sure that those opportunities are available to people. Um, so, like, to back to your original point, I'm not sure where the breakdown is. West Virginia students can get an education if they reach out and grab it. There's a lot of people working very hard to make sure that those opportunities are available. Um, but whether it's through anti-intellectualism, or um, the there's still a really prevalent idea that you can walk out with a high school diploma and find a job that'll pay a living and provide for a family. There's a disconnect there that 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 causes a certain amount of young people to not take advantage of the opportunities that they're given. And then, a couple of years goes by after they graduate and they realize that their life's not getting any better. And now those opportunities have passed. And then you end up with what I, call the Appalachian hopelessness, which is like, this is my life now. And the things that I'm going to have to sacrifice to make it better, um, I don't even know how to navigate. If you're, your average, high school graduate, and you want to do something like declare bankruptcy and, seek out a student loan, that process is so convoluted and involved and stressful that, you're, you know, that you almost find staying in debt and not pursuing those opportunities more comfortable.
Did they teach you things like those processes in school
Um,
from a financial management perspective? Like,
by and large, no.
and why do you think that is, really?
I think, hmm,
Because that's been one of my major points of advocacy with respect to public education is financial management. I took a money management class in high school. They told you how to balance a checkbook, stuff, basic fundamental stuff. But it seems like there's so much more that could be taught with regard to effective personal finance that's just not really touched upon. I don't know if you
Uh,
experienced that or not.
I'll give you my best guess at it. So,
Sure.
what I would say is that if you look across the state in macro, right? So you have in the education system the assessments. So whether or not you judge that a school is successful or not is based mostly on mathematics instruction and English instruction and a few other things around the periphery. So if you're a school administrator and I come to you and say, well, we're going to slash your budget by 20% and we're going to assess you on English and math, then what programs are you going to cut?
Exactly.
You're going to cut financial literacy, you're going to cut home economics,
Shop class.
shop class, you know. So you're going to make sure that the money goes to English and math, which are valuable, um, but there's not going to be a whole lot left over for those other programs that teach those life skills.
Right. So you got to do the best you can to work within the predefined standards of the education system.
Well,
I,
it's incentive,
I
right?
think
So
that's what's always kind of driven me kind of crazy about the education system in general is that there's a breakdown with respect to here's some really useful things that could be taught, but we don't have the resources to teach them. And here's what's mandated by the state for us to teach so we can, reach their standards and continue to receive funding, etc. And there's a breakdown there, and it seems like, especially with financial management stuff, it's like kids could really benefit from having a better understanding of, hey, here's how you don't get into several $1,000s worth of debt as a young person and spend the rest of your life trying to pay that off.
well, I'm gonna have to split on you, brother. I hate to do this to you because we were having such a good conversation. Um,
Oh, that's fine, man. Yeah, I appreciate you taking the opportunity to talk to me.
yeah, so I have an engagement at 5 o'clock, but I would definitely be up for a part two if you
Yeah,
were.
let's do that. I'm gonna plug your book when I finally release this. I'm gonna put the link in the description and everything, and we'll continue this later down the line if that's cool. But thank you for talking to me, man.
Yeah, man. Well, I appreciate your time and I appreciate the plug. And, if you ever wanted to talk about non-West Virginia things, I think the conversation was good. And,
Yeah,
we eh, have a lot of overlap and interest in conversation topics. So I think it would be good.
yeah. I'll talk about anything, man. Let's do another one later down the line, okay?
All right.
I
Appreciate it.
appreciate it. Have a good night, man.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Yep. Bye.